Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nick Foster. I am the interim director of the Wilton Historical Society, and I'd like to welcome you all to the second edition of this year's 5-part history lecture series entitled Tycoons, Bane or Benefactors. On behalf of the Wilton Historical Society and the Wilton Library, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Sue Sherwood, and thank you to all of you who donated as part of their registration. Programs like this can't exist without your support, so thank you to Sue and everyone. I'd also like to thank the planning committee who organizes the lecture series, which is now in its 15th year of bringing these engaging and thought-provoking presentations to the community. It's quite an effort to plan this series from initial concept to the executing here in the spring. So I'd like to applaud their commitment to that effort. So thank you to the planning committee. One note before we begin, please take note of the Q&A function on your screen. Please use this button to enter any questions you may have during the presentation. We'll have a moderated Q&A session at the end of the lecture. So by typing your question in that Q&A section, the panel can address it at the end. So with all that said, without further ado, let me turn it over to our moderator, Steve Hudspeth, who will be introducing today's speaker. Steve.
Thank you very much, Nick. We extend a warm Wilton welcome to Susan Berfield. Susan has been with the Bloomberg Business Week for a dozen years, half of them as an investigative reporter. For 10 years before that, she was an associate editor of Business Week, and before that, a senior writer for Asia Week magazine. She is an alumna of Brown University with a master's in international affairs from Columbia. Susan's work has ranged from covering 9/11 from the vantage point of being one of the few foreign journalists in Afghanistan that day, to extensive coverage of the pandemic, both as to its impact on business, which is her major beat, of course, and covering the way individual states were handling pandemic response, which were succeeding better than others and why. Most recently, her writings have included 2 months ago a major feature article growing out of McDonald's settlement with 2 of its franchisees within 1 week's time over claims of racism and racial discrimination. Under the headline, How McDonald's Made Enemies of Black Franchisees, it gives a very detailed, carefully researched, and frankly devastating account of the allegations of how McDonald's in effect redlined choices of franchises for Black franchisees and disadvantaged Black franchisees more generally. Susan's topic this evening is J.P. Morgan, and she is a real authority on the subject. Her book, The Hour of Fate, Teddy Roosevelt, J.P. Morgan, and the Battle to Transform American Capitalism, came out in May of 2020, and actually in May of this year is going to come out in paperback. Morgan may well be one of America's best examples from the 19th into the 20th century of how a tycoon can be, in the words of our series, both a benefactor and a bane. Within only 3 years in the first decade of the 20th century, he both rescued the US from the panic of 2007, simply by his own word in support of major American financial institutions, and yet also was found by the US Supreme Court to have engaged in such a major monopolization of American railroads from the Midwest to the West as to threaten the fundamental livelihood of farmers and merchants throughout the Western United States. Now that's one powerful tycoon, and it will be fascinating to hear Susan's take on him. With many thanks to tonight's sponsor, and without further ado, I give you Susan Berfield.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I appreciate all of the kind words in your introduction. I'm sorry, I just have to make one correction. I wasn't actually in Afghanistan on 9/11. I was on the 43rd floor of the Business Week office building in Midtown Manhattan. Everything else is true, though, and thank you very much for the warm welcome. No problem. Anyway, with that, I'd like to begin talking about J.P. Morgan. And I am going to begin with a slideshow, and then looking forward to answering any of your questions at the end. So John Pierpont Morgan, as many of you may know, was born in Hartford, Connecticut, 1937. He preferred to be called Pierpont, but his schoolmates nicknamed him Pip. He was a sickly child, an indifferent student, except that he loved math and excelled in it. His family moved to London when he was in high school, and he continued his education in Europe. Now, his father, Junius, was a private banker, and he had an idea to build a Morgan dynasty, and it would be based on bringing European investment into America. Now, once Pierpont had finished his education, his father sent him to New York, and he continued to operate under his father's close watch there. Like many men of means, he paid about $300 for someone to take his place in the army during the Civil War, and he managed to profit from some wartime financing. After the war, the biggest, most complex industry was the railroads. Lincoln had believed that transcontinental railroads could be a nation-building project. And Morgan helped provide European capital to this growing industry. But it was an exhausting, challenging business. And every couple of years, he tried to retire, and his father wouldn't let him. Morgan said that he could do a year's work in 9 months, but not 12. And so from a pretty young age, he began taking extended European vacations. Ultimately, he'd become a great collector of art and manuscripts. Morgan's father died in 1890, and finally, Pierpont was on his own. Now, in the early 1900s, Morgan was at the height of his power, but he was also about to be held accountable for how he wielded that power. And the man who was going to do that was the new president, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt wanted to ensure that the government had a say in how big business operated, and that the tycoons were not above the law. Now, Roosevelt was kinetic and young, a moralist and an opportunist. Morgan, by that point, was the Jupiter of Wall Street, a man who controlled more money than any other in the country, probably the world. He wasn't the wealthiest then, he was never the wealthiest, but he was the most influential. Now, Roosevelt and Morgan had some similarities. Neither of them would admit it at the time, though. They were both born into privilege, though Morgan was about 20 years older. They were both unwell when they were young. They were shaped by strong fathers. Their mothers were often at a remove. They both lost their first wives to illness. They remarried, and they each suffered bouts of depression. By 1902, they thought they knew what was best for the nation. Both believed that America and American capitalism needed a guiding hand, and each assumed it should be his. The election of 1900, William McKinley had campaigned as the agent of prosperity. America at that time was becoming wealthy and anxious about the inequities. And there were conflicting ideas about what, if anything, to do about that. The great rush of post-war industrialization had left resources and power accumulating in ever fewer hands. Standard of living was improving overall, but workers, a growing number of immigrants among them, were fighting for protection. Pervasive racism meant many African Americans struggled to rise out of poverty. They faced violence and disenfranchisement, and most women couldn't vote. And when they worked outside the home, they were paid less than men. Theodore Roosevelt was McKinley's vice president, but he wasn't eager to accept the nomination. Roosevelt, at that point, had been a New York assemblyman, a rancher, an author, a government reformer, police commissioner in New York City, Rough Rider, and New York governor. As governor, he had angered Morgan and Wall Street by trying to enact tax reforms. He has been a disturbing element wherever he's been, said a prominent member of the New York Republican establishment. And they hoped by sending him to Washington as vice president, they would diminish his power. On the eve of their inauguration in March 1901, Morgan announced the creation of the first billion-dollar American corporation, United States Steel. It was a grandiose, thrilling, and frightening prospect. The company would be in charge of almost half of the country's steel output, and it would be worth double the entire federal government's revenue. McKinley was dazzled by Morgan, but the admiration wasn't mutual. In the financier's world, Washington was a second-rate power. But the financier's world was about to change. On September 6th, 1901, McKinley was visiting the Pan American Expo in Buffalo, New York, designed to show off Americans' achievements and ambitions. About 2,000 people were waiting outside the Temple of Music on that Friday afternoon. The weather was humid and heavy, and many had handkerchiefs. National Guard soldiers paced in front of the entrance, and local police hovered, but no one noticed Leon Czolgosz. He had a handkerchief wrapped around his right hand in which he held a gun. He stood near the front of the crowd, inconspicuous, in his pressed gray suit, flannel shirt, and black string tie. He appeared as a mechanic, a printer, a shipping clerk, an eyewitness noted later. McKinley smiled and reached to shake Czolgosz's left hand. As Czolgosz stepped forward, he raised his right instead and fired 2 bullets. The first grazed the president, but the second went deep into his abdomen, puncturing his pancreas and kidney. "I done my duty," Czolgosz said, as the police and security officials waiting in line hit and kicked him. Now, who was Leon Czolgosz? He was a disillusioned, unmoored former factory worker. He had once been employed by one of the small companies that Morgan had bought up to help create US Steel. Nearly 400 miles away in New York, everything seemed just as it should that afternoon as Morgan prepared to leave work. The streets around his headquarters at 23 Wall Street were quiet, but the cheerful ease of the wealthy was about to end. On Wall Street, Morgan was king. He controlled the steel industry and the coal roads of Pennsylvania. Those were the railroads that supplied the anthracite coal that was essential to America's industrialization. He wielded power in banks and financial institutions other than his own. He and his partners sat on the boards of dozens of companies. He was the boss of bosses. When the US government needed gold, Morgan provided it. And if anything was happening on Wall Street, Morgan was assumed to be behind it. So naturally, a reporter's first stop on that Friday afternoon was to Morgan's headquarters. When Morgan heard the news that McKinley had been shot, all he could say was, "This is sad, sad, sad news. It is very sad news, very sad." Roosevelt was also about 400 miles away from Buffalo in Vermont, and he said, "I feel 100 years old." 7 days later, as McKinley lay dying, Roosevelt returned to Buffalo, and he was inaugurated there on September 14th. He had been warned to be cautious, not to disturb the business prospects of America. And later at the funeral in Washington, Morgan walked into the Capitol Rotunda with former administration officials. Roosevelt kept McKinley's cabinet and promised to keep his business-friendly practices. Now, Roosevelt welcomed the oil and steel companies, the railroad lines, all that had turned America into a colossus. He thought big business was not just inevitable, but necessary to the country's prosperity. He also believed it had to be accountable to the public, and he considered himself to be the public. Roosevelt would offer a square deal and later said his presidency was the fight for the abolition of privilege. So Roosevelt was asking some of the same questions that we are today. What are the obligations of the government and the wealthiest among us? Now, Morgan, then in his 60s, was physically intimidating, and his defining feature was his diseased, bulging nose. He called it part of the American business structure. Morgan had an aristocratic disdain for public sentiment. He believed he knew what was best for the country, and he wanted America to be a global economic power. He believed in free enterprise, but on an industrial scale. He preferred cooperation to competition, self-regulation rather than government regulation, and above all, order and stability. The growing antagonism toward the rich was a problem Morgan couldn't understand. He didn't want to adjust to it. And when he was asked about it, he sometimes quoted his first father-in-law, Jonathan Sturgis. If God had intended that you should be the steward, he probably would have given you and not me the wealth. Now, one consequence of America's rapid industrialization was that few people could avoid everyday encounters with monopolies. The companies that traded in oil, salt, meat, whiskey, copper, lead, rope, envelopes, even paper bags had been combined and controlled. But the railroads were the most important of all those monopolies. It was the internet of its time. Communication and commerce depended on it. Railroads could alter the geography of opportunity. A town that was on a railroad line could become prosperous. One that was off the line could become impoverished. But the railroads were built recklessly, and they sucked in enormous resources, both capital and land. In the 1890s, Morgan had taken over and consolidated railroads around the country so frequently and so forcefully that the process came to be known as Morganization. Now, in 1893, the Second Depression in 2 decades began, and mostly caused by railroads being overextended and then falling into bankruptcy. Now, Morgan would benefit, but he was also weary. He wrote, everything here, I'm sorry. He wrote to his father that everything here was blue with indigo. And he said, I hope that we shall soon see things for the better, for it is very depressing and very exhausting. And he spent that summer living mostly aboard his yacht. The hard economic times led to labor unrest, and the Pullman Palace Company, the workers there, staged a strike that turned bloody. Morgan and most tycoons didn't object to a violent government response. Often they advocated for it. Sometimes they helped pay for it. 2 years into the Depression, amid bank failures and a run on gold, the government nearly ran out of its gold reserves. President Grover Cleveland reluctantly accepted a bailout by Morgan. I was never so excited in my life as at the interview, Morgan told a friend later about his meeting with the president. This was a meeting that Morgan had insisted on. He went on to say, everything depended on my changing Mr. Cleveland's mind about whether or not to accept Morgan's help. When I went into the room, I had an unlighted cigar in my hand. As I arose from the chair to go, I had no cigar, but saw on the floor a little pile of snuff. Morgan's plan worked, but when he refused to reveal his profits on the deal, about $300,000, Cleveland's fellow Democrats excoriated him. It was bad enough that Morgan, the king of Wall Street, had extended his command to the heartland. Now he was giving instructions to Washington. Morgan didn't understand this criticism. He believed he alone could protect the national interest, the soundness of America's reputation, and even though he had a singular interest in doing so, he expected Americans to trust his motives. He said his patriotism called him to act. A fascinating and lucrative patriotism, one Wall Street broker said. Now, in May 1901, just months after Morgan had created US Steel and McKinley and Roosevelt had taken office, a very public stock market battle led to even more criticism of Morgan. A rival railroad tycoon, Edward Harriman, attempted a hostile takeover of Morgan's most important railroad, the Northern Pacific. Speculators and short sellers jumped in, and some were sent in by Morgan's own firm. On one day, the price of that stock and others went up and down by so much that a good part of Wall Street was technically insolvent for a couple of hours. Morgan made sure that no banks failed, but no one was looking out for the smaller investors. Many faced ruin as a result of that day in May. It was the biggest stock market crash in a century, and many people believe Morgan was responsible for allowing a fight among the tycoons to wreak public havoc. Morgan was in Europe at the time. He was undaunted. After the panic subsided, he resumed his vacation, and in June, he dined at Windsor Castle with the new king, Edward VII. When Morgan returned to New York at the end of the summer of 1901, he and his partner James Hill started negotiating with Harriman to combine their 3 railroad lines to create the biggest railroad monopoly of them all. It would be called Northern Securities. It would be worth some $400 million. It would dominate the Northwest, and Morgan hoped beyond, and would soon become the perfect target for a new president eager to enforce the few laws meant to constrain big business. A decade earlier, Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Law. And since then, it had been erratically and mostly unsuccessfully enforced. So when Morgan announced the formation of Northern Securities, just 2 months after Roosevelt took office as president, it seemed the perfect opportunity to try to test the law in a case that would be watched widely. Not everyone in Roosevelt's cabinet thought that was a good idea. Roosevelt's own Secretary of State called the Sherman Act an idiotic law, which had been wisely allowed to remain dormant. But in February 1902, Roosevelt's Attorney General, Philander Knox, announced that the government was charging Northern Securities with violating the antitrust law. Morgan was stunned. He was used to the White House conferring with the House of Morgan. And Wall Street itself was dazed, incredulous, indignant. Traders described Roosevelt's attack as a thunderbolt out of a clear sky, unreasonable, beyond comprehension, dangerous, theatrical. One broker was ready to bet $1,000 that Roosevelt wouldn't receive the nomination for the presidency in 1904. Now, eventually, the Supreme Court decided in the government's favor, but it was close, 5-4. Nonetheless, the decision confirmed that the government had the right to defend the public interests when they conflicted with corporate interests. People will love him for the enemies he made, newspaper wrote of Roosevelt. On the day of the decision, reporters gathered at Morgan's office on Wall Street, but he said nothing. His losses were evident. 6 months of secret negotiations to create the second largest company in the world, wasted. The prospect of earning tens of millions of dollars from a globe-spanning transportation system, now a dream. But above all, Morgan had lost the prerogative to conduct business exactly as he thought best. Northern Securities Company decision, almost as bad as possible, Morgan's son Jack, who was in town from London, telegraphed back to his office. But it does not destroy the values of the properties involved, he said. Dissenting opinions very strong and by the best men. And Morgan later would say that because of the way that the railroad's ownership was structured, that is, he and his partners owned a good deal of the shares, that they would be able to continue operating as they chose, and then it would be hard to unscramble the eggs. Now, during the 2 years that Morgan and Roosevelt were fighting in the courts from 1902 to 1904, they shared a mutual suspicion and antagonism. But at one crucial moment, they had to cooperate. In May of 1902, so this is just a few months after Roosevelt had challenged Morgan in the courts, 147,000 anthracite coal miners in Pennsylvania went on strike. We could think of them as the essential workers of their time. America's industrialization depended on anthracite, but the miners, many immigrants from Europe, were underpaid and undervalued and vulnerable. The strike that began that morning in May would reveal itself to be much more than a protest for fair wages and treatment, more than a face-off between labor and capital. It was a confrontation between a past where power was concentrated and a future where it could be shared. Now, anthracite was a hard coal. It burned cleaner than the soft coal. It made possible stronger grades of steel for railroad tracks, generated steam for locomotives and manufacturing. It warmed homes and schools. The anthracite coal land in Pennsylvania was controlled by the railroads, and the railroads were controlled by Morgan. The miners were among the most vulnerable workers. Their jobs were among the most dangerous in America. And the other workers who had the most dangerous jobs were working for the railroads. When the union began recruiting members, anthracite miners hadn't received a wage increase since 1880. And of the 147,000 miners who went on strike, 24,000 were boys. Many worked as what was called breaker boys, seen here. Now, they were supposed to be at least 12 years old to work, but many began working when they were about 8. Fake birth certificates were provided by the mine inspectors, signed by parents desperate for their sons' wages, notarized for about 25 cents, and accepted without question by company supervisors. The coal breakers polluted the skies and the soil and the water. And next to the breakers were heaps of comb, the wasted coal, and there women and girls foraged for tiny pieces of coal that the breakers might have missed. The strikers persisted through the summer and into the autumn. As winter approached, Roosevelt began to get worried that there could be social unrest. The post office was threatening that it might have to shut down. Public schools were warning that they might not be able to remain open past Thanksgiving. Steel mill owners in Pennsylvania told their workers to prepare for mass layoffs. In Milwaukee, men stole wooden beer kegs from saloons to burn as fuel. Roosevelt worried about a winter of misery, of sickness, starvation, darkness. People might freeze to death. Others could riot. He understood how panic could outrun reality. And Roosevelt was a new kind of president. While previous presidents had put down strikes, often with violence, or had decided it was none of their business, Roosevelt kept a close look at the strike and tried different ways to send emissaries and intermediaries to try to negotiate some kind of settlement. He didn't want people to suffer. He was worried about the potential for social unrest, and he was comfortable with the idea of unions. He said if he were a laborer, he would join one. People also supported the miners. In New York, 10,000 people rallied in Madison Square in support of the strikers. The New York State Democratic Convention backed a call for the government to take over the mines, and even business leaders agreed. The operators do not seem to understand that the present system of ownership, or at least of management in the anthracite field, is on trial, Roosevelt wrote to a friend. Now, the union leader was named John Mitchell. He had worked in the mines starting at age 12, and he had seen the union as a career path out. He rose quickly, and he was president of the union at age 28. Mitchell, during the entire strike, was eager to talk to the mine owners, but they were not willing to acknowledge his leadership or talk to him. Now, the unofficial leader of the coal mine executives was George Bear, a protege of Morgan's. He didn't consider Mitchell a legitimate representative of the miners, and he didn't think the miners should have many rights except the right to work. He said they should be happy to have jobs, and if they weren't, plenty of others could take their places. He considered his a God-given right to control this essential resource, and nobody, not even the president, should interfere. Nonetheless, in early October, Roosevelt decided to try to broker a settlement directly. He invited the mine owners and the union leaders to Washington. Roosevelt became the first president to mediate between big business and labor, after decades in which the government had sided firmly with the former. At the meeting, Roosevelt appealed to the executives' patriotism. Meet the crying needs of the people, he said. The coal executives replied that they wouldn't meet anything but the miners' surrender. They criticized Roosevelt for forcing them into the room with fomenters of anarchy. They said the government should be prosecuting union leaders and strikers, not cooperating with them. And they left the meeting. Roosevelt was stunned and angry. He considered the coal operators to be obstinate, unwilling to adapt to changing times. The operators, he wrote, showed extraordinary stupidity and bad temper. As a last resort, he considered nationalizing the mines. It would be what he called a fairly radical experiment. But before that, he would try to get Morgan involved in settling the strike. Morgan had been in Europe all summer. He had hoped that the strike would be settled by the time he returned, and he was unhappy that it hadn't. He was concerned about the stock prices of the railroad companies. He was worried that the unrest might spread to other more profitable businesses. The strike and the owners' unyielding stand was exposing capitalism's weaknesses, and it was encouraging a hard cynicism about its practitioners. Morgan didn't understand that these fissures would last beyond the strike. He saw idle men and unworked mines and thought it was a waste. Morgan agreed to meet with an emissary from Roosevelt administration aboard his yacht, Corsair. They drew up a plan for an independent commission, which would be appointed by Roosevelt and would hear the grievances on both sides. Morgan had to pressure the mine owners to agree. For the union leaders, this was seemingly a great victory. It was what they had been asking for from the beginning. Morgan even brought the agreement down to Roosevelt. And afterward, Roosevelt wrote, "I feel like throwing up my hands and going to the circus." Once the strikers returned to work, Roosevelt wrote a letter to Morgan thanking him for getting involved. Morgan never replied. The commission heard weeks of testimony from both the miners and the coal executives. They heard tales of debt, injury, and death. And ultimately, they granted the strikers a wage increase and improved working conditions, but they didn't sanction the union. And most everyone involved thought that was fair. Roosevelt came away from the episode emboldened to pursue a progressive agenda. "I stand for the square deal," he said. "But when I say that I am for the square deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play under the present rules of the game, but that I stand for having those rules changed so as to work for a more substantial equality of opportunity." Morgan came away from the experience mostly unchanged. Roosevelt won the 1904 election in a landslide, and he had reluctant support from Wall Street and even from Morgan. Wall Street and Morgan didn't like to back a loser, and it was pretty clear pretty early that Roosevelt was going to win. In his second term, Roosevelt pressed Congress to pass stricter railroad regulations and create an agency to ensure food and drug safety, what we know as the FDA. He supported unions, 8-hour workdays, an inheritance tax, and universal health care. America, he said, must not be the civilization of a mere plutocracy, a banking house, Wall Street syndicate civilization. Now, in his second term, Morgan and Roosevelt more or less operated under a detente. The White House didn't directly challenge the House of Morgan, and Roosevelt and Morgan allowed their representatives to work together when possible. But each pressed ahead, the president trying to reform capitalism, the financier defending the status quo. 3 years into Roosevelt's second term, the financial system fell into crisis. Trust companies, which are essentially unsupervised banks, were failing, and they were threatening other institutions on their way down. People were rushing to withdraw their savings. Morgan had raised money to help, and the government had contributed funds, but that wasn't enough. Wall Street was blaming Roosevelt and his stance toward business for undermining confidence. So on a Saturday in early November, Morgan invited about a couple of dozen of the banking executives into his library and locked them in until they came to an agreement about how to prevent a catastrophe. When they couldn't come up with something, finally, at 4:15 in the morning, Morgan presented a statement that committed each of the trust company presidents to providing a share of a $25 million rescue loan. "There you are, gentlemen," he said. Then he gestured to his unofficial leader. Once they had all signed, Morgan unlocked the door at 4:45 a.m. The panic subsided. People first praised Morgan for this stark display of power and then condemned him for it. Roosevelt was criticized for allowing Morgan to profit from it. The bailout would be one of the last times Morgan would exert his influence so publicly. He still loomed in the national imagination, but he was ever more clearly a man out of time. The country was leaving him behind. In 1912, Morgan was called to testify about what was called the money trust. People were concerned that in a democracy with global ambitions, too much financial power was concentrated in too few hands. Morgan had twice acted almost as a central bank. Soon, legislators would decide that the country couldn't rely on one man. It needed a Federal Reserve. During Morgan's testimony, there's one passage in particular that I think really shows how he thought about his role. So I'm going to just read a little bit of that. So in describing his decisions, Morgan's decisions, he said, "If it is good business for the interests of the country to do it, I do it." And then he was asked, "But Mr. Morgan, is not a man likely, quite subconsciously, to imagine that things are for the interests of the country when they are good business?" "No, sir," said Morgan. Then he was asked, "You think that you are able to justly and impartially differentiate where your own interests are concerned, just as clearly as though you had no interest at stake, do you?" "Exactly, sir." A few months later, Morgan died in his sleep in Rome. He was 75 years old. Morgan left his library with its tremendous collection of rare manuscripts and art. He twice rescued the country from potential financial catastrophe. He invested in essential industries, railroads, steel, electric power. He left a financial firm that is still among the most influential in the country. And he left a complicated legacy of concentrated power and wealth, eccentric philanthropy, and disregard for social justice. Like a few before him and many after, he leaves us to ask, even if some Americans benefited, who paid the price for his ambitions and achievements? So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to answering your questions and having a discussion.
And I'm going to look for questions in the Q&A, but right now, let me start with a few of my own, Susan, and see where we go with that.
Sure, thank you.
The first one I'm going to apologize for from the outset because it's pretty much an imponderable, but I would appreciate your comments on how different do you think America would look today if TR had not invoked the Sherman Act successfully, as it turned out with Supreme Court, even though 5-4, if he hadn't done that?
Oof, yeah. Well, what I think I can say about that is that, of course, there were successful antitrust prosecutions after Roosevelt's term, both against Standard Oil, probably most famously, but also against a sugar trust and tobacco trust. So I think, that it was probably inevitable that eventually the antitrust law would have been put into practice, tried to be enforced. But I think it was pretty important that Roosevelt did it when he did, because, as one person said at the time, it also served as a moral tonic, to an agitated nation. So, what might have happened if people didn't feel that there was someone in Washington, the president with an awful lot of power, who was trying to stand up for them? So I think that is, the question that's really hard to answer. I think in terms of kind of the direct legislation, it might have happened, but what would the circumstances in the country have been like, without Roosevelt's actions?
Well, that's a very powerful answer. Let me ask you another one of those imponderable questions. Comparing the anthracite coal industry at the time, the steel industry, and railroads certainly, with today's Facebook and Googles and the like, Do you see the analogy there, or is the power of a different sort in the heavy industry areas versus what they are in technology today?
Yeah, well, I think, what I would say is that, I mean, those were industries, that were essential to, America's industrialization, its economy, and to people's lives, yes, in much the way that technology is today. I mean, we could imagine living without it, but just barely. Um, and I think what Americans were worried about then was in part about, as we are today, about control, control not just over markets, but over labor markets and employees. And I think what we see happening now is also in terms of the antitrust and kind of holding big business to account is an understanding that the danger of a monopoly is not just in the prices that it can charge, because as we see today, like a lot of the, technology, social media that we use is in theory free. I mean, we pay for it with our data and our privacy, but it's free. But, what those monopolies, if you want to call them that, give to companies is an incredible amount of control over their customers' lives and their employees' lives. And I think in that way, it's very similar to how Americans felt about the companies that they were dealing with then.
There's one question that's come across that's apropos to this, I think, and that is, what if McKinley had not died and we therefore didn't get Teddy Roosevelt?
Yeah, well, that is a really interesting question. I mean, McKinley, was a very business-friendly president, and the cabinet would not have pushed him to act. When Roosevelt asked his attorney general to look into bringing a case against Northern Securities, he kept it a secret from everybody in his cabinet. So I don't think that McKinley would have felt the pressure to proceed against Northern Securities or any of the other monopolies. And I don't think he had the temperament to do it. So I think it would have, waited, would have needed to wait for a new president. Would that have been Roosevelt one day? Roosevelt thought so. Would it have been Taft as it was after Roosevelt? Maybe. And he also pursued an antitrust agenda. But yeah, I think everything would have been delayed. But I think it was inevitable. And so I think it would have just put off the inevitable.
Well, and the second great question just popped up, under what circumstances led to the enactment of the Sherman Antitrust Act? And I think what they're specifically focused on is, how in the world did the Sherman Antitrust Act ever get passed, given what you've described as to the state of the thoughts about antitrust regulation in that period?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. Well, I think, there was a concern, and this was about in 1890 it was passed. There was a concern about the kind of what they called, monarchical almost powers of business people and of monopolies. And Sherman and others did view it as undemocratic. And I think that was really interesting. And, it was kind of the right combination of people. And, it came at a time in America where there was a lot of social and labor unrest. I just alluded to strikes that occurred among the railroad workers, later among the coal miners, but there was a lot of social unrest in the 1870s and then again in the 1890s. And I think members of Congress saw this as one way to exert a little authority over business. But, as everyone has noted with their questions, left to enforce it, attorneys general often did not. And so it was, a good law that took a while to be put to the test.
And they've said in the antitrust law, there's always been what you've just described, that social policy component, as well as the economic component. I think it's been said in the last 50 or so years, the focus has been on the economic component. Now it may be back to, as you're describing it with high tech, the social policy issues that were so prevalent at the turn of the century.
That's right.
So here's some more great questions. I'm going to take them in different order here, because one relates directly to what we were just talking about. Do you think Teddy Roosevelt could do what he did because he was an aristocratic person and not afraid to do what he thought was right?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yes, I think, in some ways, Roosevelt was often accused of kind of turning his back on his class. But I think he probably had a certain confidence, coming from a very privileged family, 7 generations in Manhattan. And I think that his father was a great philanthropist himself, and exposed Roosevelt to even parts of New York, the Lower East Side, where obviously a lot of immigrants lived, parts of New York that people like Morgan probably never saw. So I think Roosevelt grew up and then focused his early political career on reforming the political system and holding to account the people who he grew up with, and who were kind of colleagues of his father's.
Great. And roughly with respect to the same period, the Clayton Antitrust Act comes, I think, in about 1914. The question asks, I recall learning that the Clayton Antitrust Act put, quote, teeth into the Sherman Antitrust Act, end quote. Can you discuss?
Yeah, well, I think, consider that the Sherman Antitrust Act passed in 1890, and the first time it was really used to great effect, was in a Supreme Court decision in 1904. So there had been cases that had been brought before ultimately the Supreme Court in those intervening years. But the court always found ways to decide mostly in favor of business. So I think, the Sherman and the other writers of the law understood that it was, as many laws are, kind of experimental, that it needed to be refined over time. But they were faced with Supreme Courts that were unwilling to do that for many, many years. So it did take, another revision of it, and then subsequent revisions, to make it more potent, and also to adapt to the way that business changed. Businesses change according to the conditions, and so laws often have to change to keep up with them. That's what we're seeing now, I think, with the big tech companies.
Well, and as I recall, the Clayton Act was amended to add the incipiency provisions of Section 7 in around 1950, which really made it possible to attack business acquisitions in a way that had never been possible before, short of monopolization, but nevertheless very serious.
Yes.
I'm going to go on to one that takes us into the future, or into the present at least, as some of my earlier questions did. Is there a danger of elevating form over function? What about the role of big tech in controlling all the streams of commerce that feed its engine? Isn't that alone a factor that cries out for breakup and regulation?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. And, I do think that there's a growing concern about just that, right? And, there's the ways in which these companies have become and, deeply embedded and insinuated themselves in almost every way that, people, interact commercially, whether it's individually or companies. And there is the important kind of social component in terms of misinformation, in terms of data breaches, privacy. And so, yeah, I think, that there's all sorts of reasons to look really closely at the power that these companies have accumulated really quickly, and for legislation, regulation, and potentially breakups, to catch up to where these big companies are.
When we have two more questions that take us back to the earlier period, very interesting ones. Who succeeded J.P. Morgan at the helm of his businesses, and how did those businesses change over time?
Yeah, so Morgan's son, Jack, who I mentioned briefly, who had been working in London for a while, took over the firm. Many of Morgan's partners were a bit younger than he. And so, they all remained in terms of, positions on the boards. And the firm, I think, remained very important and is very influential today. But I think it's also fair to say that without Morgan himself, it lost a little bit of its position, influence, and then just the nature, of Wall Street. It's like tremendous expansion. I don't think there is a firm today that we could consider like the equivalent of, of Morgan's firm at the turn of the last century. And I think that's a good thing.
Here's one from Professor Matt Warshauer, who was our speaker of the first session, as you know, because you were very kind to attend it. And he asked, to what extent do you think that Teddy Roosevelt's experience with muckrakers like Lincoln Steffens influenced his views? He met Steffens while serving as New York City police commissioner.
Yeah, they were close. Well, I think, Roosevelt had a really interesting relationship with a lot of journalists and their editors. And I think it was, that he, of course, tried to influence them, but they also definitely influenced him. And I think he understood, he was a writer himself. He understood the power of the media. I think, he wanted them to kind of work on his side and, if not at his behest, but to kind of be working in parallel with him. And in truth, there was a lot of intersection, in terms of what they were revealing and what he was interested in reforming. So I think, it was a pretty close relationship. And I think in many ways, Roosevelt had a lot of respect for them, brought journalists, into his confidence pretty frequently, and kept up a really busy correspondence, with a lot of them.
That's fascinating. And we've got another philosophical question, a really interesting one. Do you believe that the industrial age corporations had to become monopolies that needed to be regulated, reined in by the government in order for the country to reap their benefits? And I think they're talking scale economies here. For example, the size and scope of railroads at the time, does that benefit counterbalance some of the costs?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. And I think it kind of gets at the heart of the question animating this series, which is, right, Morgan and a lot of these tycoons, they did help build an industrial America. They often did help make some of these industries more efficient. And the ways that they did that, of course, were by taking control of them. And, I think some of that was necessary and inevitable. And I guess I also think that it could have been possible to consider some of the workers. The railroad workers had incredibly dangerous jobs, and no worker protection, no safety protection. They probably could have been paid a little bit more and taken care of a little bit better, and we still could have had efficient railroads. I think the same might have been true with the coal miners. So I guess I don't see it as a kind of either or, but the question that I think a lot of companies and people and the government are asking now, which is like, what is the responsibility of big business to the people that it employs and that it serves? And that is their only responsibility to their shareholders or their investors? And I think for many people, the answer to that question is no. They have a broader responsibility. People would like that to see them take it, but at the same time, no one, I don't think, wants to be beholden to a company to decide to offer paid sick leave or extended maternity leave. That there's policies that the government needs to put in place because no one wants to have to depend on their employer for everything.
There's an observation here that came in through the chat instead of Q&A.
Yep.
It says, an observation, albeit women still have the right to vote and one can change names, but this all sounds applicable to today. History should not be repeated so completely. Wouldn't that be nice?
Okay.
It's a telling
Agree.
and very true observation.
Agree.
Then there's a question which really takes you pretty heavily into antitrust law. So I'm going to read it to you, but don't feel obligated to answer it. In terms of antitrust regulation, are the standards the same for businesses that manufacture products versus service businesses like social media?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And I think I probably am not going to be able to answer it very specifically, but I think what I can say is that, the bigger concern now is about, the tech companies, though, of course, we can see with the administration that they are looking at, antitrust among companies that do, kind of manufacture and produce goods too. But I think the bigger and probably the trickier questions are going to be about the technology companies. And I think it's because of the way that they are so embedded in our own lives, and because there is this other dimension to them, in terms of misinformation, disinformation, privacy, data, everything that I just think are the kind of really big issues of our time. But for sure, companies that are more are focused on manufacturing, airplanes or, the airlines or whatever it is, will come under some scrutiny too.
And while the Google complaint was not subject to a motion to dismiss, the Facebook complaint, the original complaint was, and got dismissed for failure to define markets effectively, which I think goes to the issue. With hard manufacturing, you can define markets much more precisely than you can in social media.
Yeah.
Yet these social media operations have such power, from disinformation to allowing people on to privacy control. It's a huge power, much bigger than any hard manufacturing company probably ever wielded, short of the railroads, maybe in Morgan's time.
That's right. And, and I think, Roosevelt ultimately came to believe that regulation was more effective than litigation. And I think, that's something probably that people in Congress are obviously also considering.
Well, and I think he may be a concern because in the Northern Securities case, the railroad case, was a 5-4 Supreme Court decision, as you know.
Yeah.
And one of the dissenters is, I believe, Oliver Wendell Holmes, right?
Yeah, that's right.
He knew a person of a lot of both mental capacity and power on the court was not necessarily aligned with him. And that could have been a big problem if he tried to push it too hard.
Yes.
So off to regulation.
Yeah.
Well, there's so many other questions we could ask here, and I might do just one or two more to see if anybody else would like to come on. But before I do that, I do want to mention to everybody something you should know, which is if you would like to have an autographed copy of Susan's book, you can go to her website, which is Susan Berfield. You see her name right there on the screen, susanberfield.com. And she will be very happy to do that for you. I mean, the title is absolutely extraordinary. And know the quality of the work you do in your journalism for Bloomberg Business Week. It's got to be an incredible book. I wish I'd already read it, and I should have already read it before coming to moderate this session, but rest assured, I'm going to be reading it very shortly. I love this title. Yeah, well, I love your title, The Battle to Transform American Capitalism. My word, that really says it all, doesn't it? It's quite a saga. Let me ask you one more I have here, and then we'll move on. Those 147,000 anthracite coal miners were in a very difficult position, right? Because as the anthracite coal was withheld, many poor people in northern cities in particular in that winter were faced with bone-chilling circumstances, right?
Yeah.
How did that kind of, the union leaders, how did that all balance out in their thinking about what they should do as they try to fight these huge, powerful forces?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. Right from the beginning, John Mitchell was, very concerned both about the strikers and kind of their ability to subsist, endure without any pay as the strike continued. And he was concerned about the effect on people, especially the poor in the cities. And, from almost the start of the strike, well, in fact, actually, even before the strike, he made repeated efforts to talk to any of the coal mine owners, and they refused him almost every time. And so, when Roosevelt invited Mitchell and the mine owners down to Washington, Mitchell kind of rode into Shenandoah, one of the main towns in Pennsylvania, and he was like greeted with a parade. Everyone was very, very excited about the prospect, first of Mitchell being heard, and nonetheless being heard by the president. So, everyone was, very, very concerned. I guess you could say almost everyone except the coal executives. I mean, obviously, as people, they must have had some concern, but they were really, really stubborn, and they resisted the president's efforts. So just think about that. They were summoned down to Washington. They didn't want to go, but you cannot refuse the president's invitation, but they did resist his entreaties. And it was really only when Morgan, essentially their boss, told them that they had to agree to an independent commission that they finally did.
Was the independent commission really, in Morgan's view, a safety valve that would get him out of a very, very difficult situation?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, Morgan, as you could probably tell, operated at a remove. He didn't run, he ran his firm, but he didn't run any of these companies. He liked to keep his distance, and the coal strike was really messy, and he did not want to get involved in that. He really, really, really wanted the strike to be resolved by the time he, floated into the New York harbor in August, and only got involved very reluctantly.
So he didn't lock all the mine owner executives in his library the way he did with the bankers and make them sign that deal.
He might have if he needed to, but he didn't have to.
After the commission bailed him out for that.
Yeah.
That's that's very cool there. And I guess in a broader sense, the kinds of concerns that we've been talking about go to the heart of what America is as a country, right? Who runs our country? Who will have that power? Do we want plutocrats a la Russia? Probably not.
Right.
But do we want an economy that is enriched by people who have a big, big financial stake in doing well and making the country prosper? It's a tough balancing act that we've lived with for a long time, right?
Yeah. I think, what you're getting at, and what the book is in part intended to show, is that, these are sort of, perpetual questions that we have to ask. Like, there's never going to be a single answer because things are always going to change. There will be reforms, and then, businesses will find ways to adjust to those reforms, and there will be new people in charge in government and, at the heads of companies, and, it's always going to change. But so I think for me, the way I came to understand it is that these are questions that we just always have to be asking.
As I recall, Teddy Roosevelt got the Nobel Peace Prize for having mediated the war between Russia and Japan, right?
Yeah.
So on top of all these things he's dealing with domestically, he's dealing with a major foreign political crisis. And he handles it all. The guy's truly amazing.
He had a lot of energy.
I guess he did, and a lot of courage to take on really tough challenges and not be afraid of them. I mean, that seems to be the cornerstone of his whole life, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I came to appreciate about him was that I think he understood that he came from extraordinary privilege and that he had a responsibility, to Americans. And I think it went beyond kind of the noblesse oblige of his father, which it wasn't kind of just, giving away money, but really trying to get in there, get involved, and to make changes when he could. Roosevelt had a lot of other, things that, we would be I'm less encouraged about, but, in that regard, I think he was genuine in trying to improve the situation for a lot of Americans.
Very interestingly, Morgan kind of fell into his position inherited from his father, right? Thrust upon him.
Yeah.
Whereas Roosevelt, as I'm hearing his description here and reading elsewhere, Roosevelt really created his own opportunities and his own way forward in the way you've described. Very different for all the similarities. And I was fascinated by it. I didn't realize all those similarities between them. That difference in how they came to their positions seems quite dramatic.
Yeah, I mean, for someone of Roosevelt's background, it was quite unusual to become a politician. Not everyone in his family was so thrilled by it. There were people who tried to talk him out of it. For Morgan, right, he accepted the position, but he did balk a little bit. He did, as I said, like, kind of try to retire, and like there were times when he definitely wished he could walk away. But at a certain point, I think, and maybe it was after his father's death, that he seemed to become more comfortable in a position of power and kind of taking command of situations, and using his influence.
Do you view his taking commands of situations like U.S. Steel example, was consolidation with 50% of the steel market, did you say at the time, and the railroads where he's going to 100% control of everything? Do you find that that was something he really wanted in his heart to do, or again, was it sort of thrust upon him because he was in the position his father had left him with?
Well, I think in those situations, and by that time, I think he could see what America could become in terms of a global economic power. I think he, just by nature of his personality, but also just as a financial person, he hated to see what he considered kind of inefficiency and waste. And kind of the chaos of, capitalism in those days, right? I mean, the ways that the railroads were built, basically unregulated, like anybody could essentially build a railroad anywhere if you had money, right? Which is why so many of them went bankrupt. And I think Morgan felt that he had to protect his investors. Many of them were European, but increasingly American. And, his role was to kind of create order out of the chaos of capitalism. And I think he became kind of comfortable with that. But, you know, as I said, like he liked to do it at the big level, but he was not going to be the one running US Steel, you know, or any of those other companies. Like he was very happy also to leave the details to other people. But I think he had a notion that capitalism left unchecked was chaotic and costly and wasteful. And he didn't like any of that. But, you know, what he saw in its place was a capitalism that was controlled, you know, by one or two people, one of whom should be him.
Well, it sounds, in addition to being a power consolidator, that he actually did have a kind of an altruistic frame of mind, if not quite an antithesis to Teddy Roosevelt's. Nevertheless, more altruism there than I would have guessed, actually, in the way you describe it, which I think is very fair to him. You know, that's the balancing. That's why the series title is Bane or Benefactor.
That's right.
You know, well, with that, I think I will say a very special thank you to Susan. It's been very, very illuminating. We appreciate so much your being here and giving us your insights, and looking forward very much to reading your book. So
thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Susan and Steve. That was fascinating and as thought-provoking as all of our lectures are. So thank you so much for taking the time, Susan, to speak with us today. And thank you to Steve for those really enlightening questions. I want to thank everyone who was in attendance today. Thank you for coming. And just as a programming note, we will be back here next Sunday on Zoom with the next edition of the next lecture in the series, which will be Henry Ford's Borrowed Humanity, How the Same Man Lifted and Then Lost America. And that will be presented by author and historian Julie Fenster. So if you haven't registered for that, there's still time. So go check out the Wilton Library website or the Wilton Historical Society website for the opportunity to register for that. And I assume it will be as wonderful as this was today. So with that, I leave you to the rest of your weekend. Thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you next time. So take care, folks.